He is formerly a physicist at JPL, which means that he still is a physicist, and he was specialized in radio astronomy. He is an amateur astronomer with the Los Angeles Astronomical Society, and he served as president and member of the board of directors. He's a volunteer at Mount Wilson as a tour guide and a session director for the 60-inch telescope for over 30 years. So today he's going to be telling you about what you can visit and see when you take your trip up the hill to Mount Wilson. And we are delighted to be able to welcome Timothy Thomas. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, let me fire up my screen here and see if I can. Oh boy, I'm sharing something, or so it says. Voila. I hope you can all see my slide. That's the picture of Mount Wilson Observatory taken from an airplane. So I'm here to explain what you can do at Mount Wilson Observatory, all the various activities that are available, but before, why you should care, because maybe you don't. And so I want to make you care. And if you have any interest in science or astronomy along those lines, Mount Wilson Observatory is the place to go. So what I've put here is a list, just a few of the highlights, big things that happened in the world of astronomy at Mount Wilson. And the first three are the really big ones, the big ticket items. And we have a tendency to use the tagline, the Mount Wilson Observatory is where we found our place in the universe. And you might think it pretentious for me to write that Harlow Shapley discovered the Milky Way galaxy in 1914 to 1918, considering that it's a spectacularly naked eye object and you can see it in dark skies without any problem. But the deal is that nobody knew what they were looking at. They just saw stuff in the sky and argued about what it may or may not be. But it wasn't until 1914 to 1918 that our astronomers, Harlow Shapley in particular, actually figured out what it was, roughly how big it was. Likewise, the rest of the universe, in the sense that we think of it now, was not known to exist. Edwin Hubble discovered that fact by discovering the existence of other galaxies and proving it during the 1920s. And of course, he also found the evidence for an expanding universe. So those first three items seriously changed the way we think of the association between ourselves and the universe. So we think radically differently now than people thought 150 or 200 years ago, because of the discoveries made at Mount Wilson. Now, George Hale and Seth Nicholson, they discovered the importance of magnetism and magnetic fields on the sun. And that is a big deal today because our dependence on satellite technology, especially GPS technology, in an era where people have forgotten how to read maps and get lost with ease, this is now much more important than it actually was to society back when the discovery was made. The other two, Albert Michelson, Francis Pease, they used what's called a stellar interferometer. The very first one successfully used in 1920 was able to measure the size of tiny little dot star in the sky. World is on Mount Wilson, called the Chara Array, run by Georgia State University and the Center for High Angular Resolution Astronomy. And they zoom in on stars and can actually see the shape of a star, the distribution of brightness across the star, star spots. It's an amazing instrument. It's the biggest of its kind in the world. And so we continue to be the biggest and best in the world at a technology that we essentially invented at Mount Wilson. And finally, on the bottom 2 points, the largest telescopes in the world for both daytime and nighttime use, looking at the sky or the sun, were at Mount Wilson Observatory throughout the first half of the 20th century. So Mount Wilson dominated the astronomical sciences, and people came from all over the world, and still do, to visit Mount Wilson Observatory. Back in the old days, they did it in order to observe and work here. For the most part, now they do it to visit because it's more historical than it is a research site, although the interferometer dominates that branch of astronomical sciences today. So hopefully this will whet your appetite for giving you a reason why you should be interested in going to Mount Wilson Observatory. Now, if I can just make my slides advance, there they go. So I want to direct your attention at first to the web page. It's mtwilson.edu, and this is our front page. I encourage you to go there. There are pull-down menus about the history of the observatory, what to do when you're visiting, educational programs, weather conditions, observing, which you can do, and I'll explain that. What I have shown here is the pull-down menu for events, and I'll be talking about that, concerts, lectures. And so I encourage you to go and explore our website and see what interests you the most about Mount Wilson Observatory. Or maybe you're interested in everything about Mount Wilson Observatory. So if I'm going to encourage you to go there, it helps if you know where to go. So here's a map that shows you how to get there. Most of you can probably find your way to the foot of the Angeles Crest Highway in La Cañada Flint Ridge. It's a windy mountain road, so you need to be prepared to drive on the road. From the ranger station at Clear Creek all the way down to La Cañada Flint Ridge and across the Angeles Forest Highway to Palmdale, that's a commuter road. So in the morning and evening on weekdays, there's a lot of traffic of people traveling over the mountains who work, say, JPL or in the LA area and live in Palmdale, use that highway pretty heavily. Once you go east of Clear Creek and head towards Red Box and Wrightwood, there's a lot less traffic. And then, of course, the Red Box Road that goes up to the observatory is very windy. So if you're really bothered by windy mountain roads, get some friend of yours who isn't to drive. But it's worth it if you ask me, but I've only been there 40 years. And then there's a little map here that shows you the observatory grounds, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So perched above the main parking lot, this black square right there, hopefully you can see my cursor arrow. There's a black square right above the main parking lot. That is the Cosmic Cafe. It's a sandwich shop, has hot dogs, coffee, drinks, some pastries. And so you can stop by and have a snack. It's actually a pretty popular place for bicycle riders. On good weather on a weekend, especially, you can see a lot of bicycles riding up the Angeles Crest Highway. And I've driven up that highway enough times to know that for me, trying to ride a bicycle up that road would be insane. But there are people out there who actually enjoy it. And maybe some of you are listening to me right now. More power to you. Congratulations on your ability to bike up that road. I'm afraid I would not be able to survive that kind of activity. I took this picture yesterday. So this is what it looks like, right now, basically. It's only open on weekends from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. But once we get into a standard time, late September, we'll start closing at 4 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. because it gets dark. And then from December to April, it's closed. So the cafe is only open on weekends and some special holidays during our regular tourist season. My slides don't like to advance. Here we go. So one thing we do is we have public tours. Here I am leading a tour a few years back, Saturday and Sunday, 11:30 a.m. and 1 p.m. We are pretty limited in people. We've had a lot fewer volunteers than we had before because of the pay. So we're shorthanded. Sometimes we have to cancel one of the tours. We haven't had to cancel a weekend yet because we just don't have a docent to do them. But the grounds are open every single day. You can just drive up there, weather and fire permitting. So you can drive up there between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. and just wander around on your own. You can go into the museum, but you can't actually get into anything unless you take one of the guided tours. A tour like this one, like the one I'm leading in this picture, will go into the big telescopes and the solar tower telescope. So here's a map that shows you, this is actually a Google Earth image where I plotted out the standard tour itinerary, which comes out to a little less than a half a mile, as you can see on the mileage chart up there. We leave from the Cosmic Cafe and walk through the parking lot. And eventually you'll make it to the Observatory Museum, a little right of center in the picture. Each tour is different. We want our docents to give the tours they're most comfortable doing. And so some docents will take you into the museum, some won't, but you can always go into the museum on your own and see what's there. Right now and through September, there is a special NASA exhibit on the Hubble Space Telescope. It's really very interesting. If you have any interest at all in the Hubble Space Telescope, you should go up to the observatory just to go to the museum and see that special exhibit. There's a lot of good stuff about the Hubble Space Telescope there. And from the museum, our standard route goes up to the 150-foot solar tower telescope, which was the largest in the world beginning from 1912. Our lead solar astronomer explains what he's doing, and you can go inside the facility and see how it works. Depending on the docent, you may or may not go down here to what's called the Snow Solar Telescope, a horizontal building. Patricia Hill, one of our star docents, loves to open it up on weekends. It's the first telescope that came to the mountain in 1904. Still works well over 100 years later. The standard tour will then take you to the 60-inch telescope. You can go inside. The 60-inch was opened up for business in 1908. Was the largest telescope in the world at its time. And this is the telescope that Harlow Shapley used to discover the Milky Way galaxy, as I alluded to before in my introduction to why you should be interested in Mount Wilson. When I guide the tours, I will take them from the 60-inch to the 100-inch, which followed the 60-inch as the largest telescope in the world, starting in 1917. And this is the telescope Edwin Hubble used to discover the rest of the universe outside the Milky Way. So as I said in my introduction, at Mount Wilson, we discovered both the Milky Way galaxy with the 60-inch and the rest of the universe with the 100-inch. And then just right next to the 100-inch building, this dark roof building here, is the control center for the optical interferometer I talked about at the beginning from Georgia State University, and their display room is here. I will take my tours into the display room and explain how the interferometer works. Some tour guides will stop down right outside the 60-inch telescope where there are two little domes, a little one here and a little one here, which are two of the 6 telescopes. There's 2 more out here and 2 more down here that make up the optical interferometer, and there's some display boards and right next to one of the domes, so you can go out here and discuss it. And then we basically abandon you out here, and you have to find your own way back to the parking lot, but there's only one road. It's not like you're going to get lost. And encourage you to stop in the museum if the tour didn't go in there to begin with. And if you're not afraid of heights and you're into really spiffy mountain views. You can go down where it says Mount Wilson here at the right edge of the map. You can go down a pathway here and off of this diagram over here somewhere to what's called Echo Rock, where you can just walk on route onto a promontory that hangs you out in the middle of space, and you look around and see mountains all around you. If you're a geologist, it's actually a pretty good place to go just to see what the mountain rock formations look like. So we do have a series of concerts in the dome, and here's a picture that shows set up for a concert in the 100-inch dome. We've changed the arrangement a little bit since then, but it looks and works pretty much the same now as it did when this picture was taken. Our musicians are here, surrounded by an audience, so I think 200 people. We have some overflow seating over on the other side of the 100-inch telescope. The acoustics in the 100-inch dome are such that wherever you are in the dome, but especially if you're on the opposite side of the dome from the musicians, the music actually sounds very good. You don't need to be sitting near them, although that always helps. And so our overflow seating is directly opposite the musicians on the opposite side of the dome, where the sound is essentially the same as being sitting next to them. You can't see them through the telescope, but you can certainly hear. This is where I was yesterday, because we had a concert yesterday, and this is the concert we had 24 hours ago. Cecilia Tson is the artistic director for our concert series. She's the principal cellist for this Long Beach Symphony Orchestra. In this case, it was a little different than our usual concert. That the Brian Lauritsen from KUSC explained how one of Ravel's string quartets is put together, how the musical phrasing continues throughout the piece, and they give little examples from the musicians, and that took about 15 minutes or so, and then they played the entire string quartet. The 100-inch dome is really good acoustics for this kind of music, and it actually works well for more vigorous forms of music. And this is the schedule that we have for the rest of the year. Our last concert will be in October. We'll have jazz music. There's a brass quintet set for August 7th. And I was a bit surprised when I heard the last brass quintet we had play up there, that despite the tone of the music being remarkably different from woodwinds or strings, it actually works very well in the 100-inch dome. And so the acoustics allow that music to flourish. We tried it once in the 60-inch dome, and it's too small and it really doesn't work for brass in the 60-inch, but it does in the 100-inch. And in October, you can hear some music by Bach and a premiere for one of the works of a French composer whose name is not entirely visible to me because the collected heads of Zoom cover up parts of my slide. Such is the problem with giving online talk. So we encourage you, if you're a music fan, to check out the concert series. Tickets are $50, as you can see here. We also have a series of lectures that we call Talks and Telescopes. The lectures start at 5 o'clock, and this is a picture of one of the lectures in progress in our auditorium. We're working on refurbishing it a little bit, but we want to keep it as kind of old and historic as we can. This is a talk that actually has a picture on the screen in the back of the image of the Newtonian platform of the 100-inch telescope. So this is what the seating looks like. Our next talk is on July 2nd, and Wendy Friedman, who used to be the director of Carnegie Observatories in Pasadena, now has a university professorship at the University of Chicago. She's going to come back and tell us about George Ellery Hale, who's the founder of Mount Wilson Observatory, and expand on what I talked about before, why Mount Wilson Observatory is so important and why you should really be interested in going there. And if you are already interested in going there and are already interested in knowing more about the science as well as the history of the observatory, you really want to come and see this lecture. And here's what the lecture series looks like coming up. The one in August, nobody's told me what it's about yet except the title, but it looks like a fusion of art and science, which is not unusual. September talk is of particular interest to me because Hal McAllister was the founder and original director of the Center for High Angular Resolution Astronomy at Georgia State University, and he directed the optical interferometer on Mount Wilson, the one that I said world. He made it so, and he's going to explain in his talk how that device works, how they were able to zoom in on stars, measure their shape, their size, and other physical characteristics using that unique instrument. And for the October talk, Laura Danley recently retired as the curator at Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. She and William, in his last name's cut off by Zoom, they're going to talk about painting, not astrophotography, but the history of painters and artists like Chesley Bonstell and others who have painted pictures of the universe, which ought to be an interesting talk, especially if you are an artist or painter. You may want to come up and check out that talk. Now, you can observe with your eyeballs through the old historic telescopes, both the 60-inch and the 100-inch. I was on observing sessions on both the 60-inch, on the 60-inch both nights, Friday and Saturday, just this weekend. This is not a picture of one of my sessions, but this is what it looks like. And if you look carefully in the center of the image here, you can see someone standing on the ladder with their foot actually on the telescope, leaning over to look through the eyepiece. You can do this on the 60-inch. We can't do it. It's unusual that we look at something low enough that you would have to do that, but it's pretty common and pretty ordinary when we're looking at the planets that you'd have to do that. But more often than not, we try to keep the telescope pointing as close to straight up as we can, just because the atmosphere is better. And we look at star clusters, planets, planetary nebula, even some galaxies. Even occasionally, if we're lucky, we can see a quasar that's 2.5 billion light years away. Now is a reasonably good season seeing it, although it looks incredibly boring in the telescope. Once you know what you're looking at, it's a lot more exciting. The prices are up there on the slide. A half night runs from sunset until 1 a.m. during daylight time, like now, and from sunset to midnight during standard time. A full night, of course, runs from sunset to dawn. We used to get a lot more full night reservations than we do now, just because people have learned that round about midnight and 1 a.m., people pretty much wear out and fall asleep on the floor or go home, and there's rarely more than a couple or few people willing to actually stay up and be active observers all night long. But half night sessions, we get a lot. We're getting a lot of activity on the telescopes. After being closed for over a year by a combination of pandemic and fire, we're doing a land office business, as they say, on the telescopes these days. But I encourage you to check out the schedule. If you're interested, you can put together a group of you and your 20 or 25 best friends. And if you spread the costs out over that many people, it's not that large. We have had individuals who want to rent their own night. We've had weddings, we've had birthday parties, we've had school groups and college groups come up, as well as amateur astronomy club. And so if you're interested in looking through the telescope, and if you're not a member of a group and you don't want to rent your own night, there are public ticket nights, and you'll see them if you go to the observatory webpage. Their public ticket night costs, I think, are $200 or $300, and we just pool a bunch of strangers up there who all share their interest in looking through the telescope, and you can still get a chance to look. And of course, if you come up for one of the lectures, that includes going over and looking through the 100-inch and the 60-inch telescopes as well. So you can do the talks and telescopes thing, or you can just go hardcore telescope and rent your own time. And so that's, I'm telling you pretty much what the events that are available up there. That covers certainly the big things, but the grounds are open, as I said, every day. You can go up there and wander around yourself. Now, the big dome over on the left is the 100-inch dome, and the 60-inch dome is over near the center of the image. So Mount Wilson Observatory began as Mount Wilson Solar Observatory. It's the Snow Solar Telescope, the horizontal building, the end of which is on the lower right, was the first telescope on the mountain. It brought up in 1904, went to work in 1905. Patricia Hill still opens it on weekends. You can go up there and check it out and see what astronomy was like well over 100 years ago. George Ellery Hale, the founder of the observatory, was particularly interested in studying the sun. He had some problems with the sun shining on his horizontal building, and he reasoned that if he could just take his horizontal telescope, and there's my hand disappearing, and make it vertical, his problems would go away. And he was right, it did. And he built the 60-foot tower to accomplish that task. And it worked so well, he immediately built a 150-foot tower. Nowadays, telescopes don't need to be built in quite this fashion, but this was cutting edge astronomy early in the 20th century. The 60-inch and 100-inch telescopes are the instruments that I said were used to discover the galaxy and discover the universe, but did a great deal more of what you might think of as mundane, ordinary astrophysics, like the kind of stuff I worked on at JPL, none of which was earth-shaking. We didn't make any huge, great discoveries. My name didn't get in the newspapers, and I didn't get a Nobel Prize, but we inched away at making small new discoveries for science, which is what most of us do. Very few people actually make big discoveries. And you can see the top of the Astronomical Museum over on the lower left. So you're encouraged, if nothing else, to just go up and wander around on your own and see the trees and the squirrels and the bird, listen to the birds. Our lead solar observer, Steve Padilla, has the ravens trained. They follow him around, and he leaves little trails of crumbs for it. Or they've got him trained one way or another. I do want to point out that there is a more substantial connection between the observatory on the mountain and what goes on down in the Vale. He was already famous when he came here. He was the founder of his own Kenwood Observatory. He was the founder of Yerkes Observatory for the University of Chicago. Then he came out and founded Mount Wilson Observatory. When he arrived in 1903 and 1904, he was already famous. And the people at the Troop Polytechnic School asked him to head a committee because they were trying to figure out how to make their school bigger and better. So he chairmaned and headed that committee, and he decided to turn Troop into a West Coast copy of his alma mater, which was MIT. So he was the primary founder of the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, only he pushed the humanities a little more than they were pushed at MIT because he was a Renaissance man. And aside from being a really good scientist, astronomer, physicist, he was a man of letters, you might say, was an Egyptologist and fascinated by history and all aspects of physics, not just astronomy and astrophysics. He founded the National Research Council in 1917, specifically to encourage scientific research that could help the US during World War I. We got into that war in April of 1917, and the finished mirror for the 100-inch telescope went up the mountain in June of 1917 in the midst of a patriotic fervor, because while the rest of the world was busy destroying itself in Europe, here we were putting up the largest telescope in the world, which the poet Alfred Noyes called the noblest weapon ever conceived by man, thinking in military terms of an assault on the sky with our big telescope. And meanwhile, in San Marino, Henry Huntington, filthy rich guy, was unsure what to do with his stuff. I think his original plan was to leave it to the Huntington, or leave it to the LA County. He asked Hale to head a committee to tell him what to do with his stuff. And it was Hale's influence that was principal in getting him to form the foundation and estate that he did, so that you now have the Huntington Research Library and Art Gallery and Gardens in San Marino. It was George Hale who pushed that. And finally, of more local interest, he was the founding director of the City Planning Commission for Pasadena. And through his appreciation for classical history and literature, he's the driving force behind the architecture of both Pasadena City Hall and the Pasadena Library building, both of which, if you look at them in the context of kind of a modern American city or even a 1920s American city, really look kind of out of place, look like odd, bizarre architecture. But that was because of Hale and his push to get this classical look in the buildings that he wanted them to have. So with that, I'm done. I've explained whatever it is I wanted to explain, why you should go to Mount Wilson, why you should be interested in going to Mount Wilson, what you can do when you get there, and the connections between Mount Wilson and down south. And in fact, I should add that Colonel Griffith J. Griffith, who was actually only a major but called himself a colonel because it's cool, he, the founder of Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles, did it because he went to Mount Wilson Observatory. He looked through the 60-inch telescope. He decided everybody should be able to do this. And then he moved to create Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles. So that's there because of Hale. JPL, where I work, part of Caltech, is there because of Hale. So there's a great deal of connection between the observatory and local history and society. And with that, I'm done, and I'll turn it over to the commanding officer of the meeting to take care of questions. Go for it.
Thank you so much, Timothy. What a fabulous presentation. Doesn't that make you absolutely want to go to Mount Wilson? There's so many different opportunities for you between just going yourself, to walking around, to concerts, to being part of a group, to view the observatories and the telescopes. Absolutely wonderful. So if you have any questions, please put them in chat. Timothy will be delighted to answer them for you. So somebody wants to know, what exactly did you do at JPL? So when I introduced you, I said you were in radio astronomy. So what is actually radio astronomy?
Okay, so I started out and was there for over 10 years in the radio astronomy group. Well, we use large radio antenna, kind of like your satellite receiving dish, and look at radio signals primarily from the planets, but you can look at quasars and galaxies and anything else. And when you look at something with your eye, you're seeing light that's emitted by atoms. When you look in radio, you're seeing invisible light, because that's what radio is actually. It's electromagnetic wave, exactly the same as light, just a lot longer, that you can't see. And it's emitted by complex molecules, and it can also be thermal emission, or it can be emitted by charged particles in a magnetic field. So what I did was I studied the atmospheres of the large outer planets, the gas giants, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and their magnetic fields. The group I was in, its principal discovery, I suppose, was that there is a correlation between solar wind and radio emission from Jupiter, which we thought ought not to be the case, but we figured out there is a way to sneak electrons into the magnetic field of Jupiter and create the correlation we saw. And that was for the doctoral thesis for Scott Bolton, who is now the principal investigator on the Juno spacecraft going around Jupiter. I also did infrared astronomy with the Spitzer Space Telescope, and I worked on a geological remote sensing project called the Advanced Spaceborne Thermal Emission and Reflection Radiometer, where my job was to compensate for the effect of the atmosphere between the ground we wanted to look at and the satellite in space. That's, in a nutshell, that's what I did.
Thank you very much. That was a lot that you did, and very, very important. Thank you very much. So someone says that they understand that Einstein had visited the observatory. Was he studying a discipline, or is he just visiting?
Yes, he did. He visited Caltech and the observatory. He wasn't there to study. He was there. He was at the observatory just to visit, because Edwin Hubble had discovered the observational evidence for an expanding universe. When Albert Einstein came up with his original theory of general relativity, he had an opportunity to predict that the universe should be expanding, because he knew his equations would not allow the universe to be static. But all the astronomers around, he diddled his equations and changed them. And then along comes Hubble to show that it is expanding, although Hubble himself never actually believed it, which is another story altogether. But once Hubble made that discovery that everybody else figured out meant the universe was expanding, Einstein went there just to see what was going on and how the discovery was made and who made it. He spent most of his time in the Carnegie Observatory office or at Caltech in Pasadena, where he collaborated with faculty members and the like. But if you look on this, my last slide, the 150-foot solar tower, there is an elevator, a little outside elevator bucket that takes you up to the top of the observatory, which we still use. It's a pretty heroic ride. I've done that myself. Somewhere out there on the internet world is newsreel footage of Albert Einstein riding up that bucket. And you can see him very clearly in the picture sitting at one end of the bucket with his hands on a large white lever that sticks up out of the bucket. That's the emergency brake. So you can see him holding the emergency brake all the way, all the way up. So smart guy, right? All the way across.
Thank you very, very much for that explanation. So how long are the telescopes open for viewing after the lectures? Who chooses what to observe, and do you take requests?
For those observing sessions after the lectures, we don't take requests. The telescope operators, and usually it's the director of the observatory at the 100 age, because he'd much rather be steering the telescope than anything else. The telescope operators decide what we're going to look at, and for the sessions following the lectures, because we have maybe 250 people who want to file through and look through as possible. So we want the telescope to be vertical as much as we can. That makes it easy for people to get to the eyepiece and view. And so we can't take requests. However, if you rent your own session on the telescope, or you join a public ticket night, or you a member of an astronomy club that goes, for those sessions, we do take requests. And if we can point the telescope at an object, we will. If we think it's going to look not very impressive, we'll tell you. But if you're the customer and you're paying for it, if you want to look at it, we'll point the telescope and look at it if it can be done. But in all cases, the telescope operator is the final authority on whether or not the telescope can be safely pointed, in particular at an object, because some are too low below the horizon limits for the telescope. There's a limit to how low we can look till we start running into things attached to the dome, and that's a bad idea. And so we have to control ourselves in that case.
Thank you for that explanation. So you mentioned that volunteers are a big part of the observatory, and you have been a volunteer for more than 30 years. So how does one sign up to volunteer?
The easiest thing to do is to go to the observatory web page. There is a form then on one of those pull down menus for prospective volunteers to fill out. You can give me your name, your email address, explain what it is you're interested in. We have volunteers for ordinary stuff, like during the big events. We need people to help park cars. We need people to shepherd people back and forth between, say, where the event is taking place in the parking lot. We need people to sit and man the souvenir selling stations, we do have a little gift shop that sometimes sets up behind the Cosmic Cafe. But we also need volunteers to help with the observing sessions. The docents and session directors actually get paid, not docents, the telescope operators and session directors actually get paid as contractors for legal reasons. The tour guide docents are all volunteers, and I'm the lead instructor for them. And so we give you the training that you need in order to do whatever volunteer work it is that you set out to do. And so we can use just about anything and everything. And if you have special skills, like all of our maintenance work on the telescopes is done by retired electrical and mechanical engineers. And you can have a lot of fun if you're really into that kind of stuff, because we have an old 1911 kerosene powered Morse and Fairbanks 2-cylinder 4-stroke generator. The two of our older mechanical engineer volunteers have completely refurbished. And during our specialty engineering tours, we fired up and you can hear it bouncing, going thump, 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 thump. There's a seismometer from Caltech right outside. They can tell whenever we turn it on because their seismometer thumps up and down. And so we have wide range of needs for volunteers, and the volunteers we would have to close because so much of what we do is animated by volunteers. So I encourage you to go and find and fill out the form and volunteer. And if you can't do that, you can get a hold of me through the library or find me somewhere. You can find me. I'm not that hard to get a hold of.
Thank you for that explanation. It sounds like there are lots and lots of opportunities for someone to get involved and volunteer at Mount Wilson. Mm-hmm. So somebody wants to know, where exactly do you get the tours? Where is the starting point?
The starting point is the Cosmic Cafe, and that's where you buy your tickets as well. And then there's one of the slides that I showed. Let's see, does this work? Okay, now I'll make you dizzy. There we go. So here, the tour starts with the yellow pin, MWO Cosmic Cafe. The main parking lot is this big lot below it. And the tours start off right here in the back corner of the Cosmic Cafe and then walk through the grounds, past the museum and into the 60 and 100-inch telescope. This is where we start.
Okay. So is the museum a kind of house, or is it somewhere in the tours?
No, it's a small relatively small display room with an auditorium attached to the back of it. So our lectures are in that auditorium. The museum is not very large and is normally populated by some old photographs and an old collection of original letters that we have laid out that George Ellery Hale either sent or received from presidents of the United States and Andrew Carnegie and his dad and strange people who think weird things are going on in space, because they existed back then too, just like they do now. But we've had to move all that out to make room for the Hubble Space Telescope exhibit, which now completely dominates the room. And there was not enough room to get it all in. So it's a slightly pared down version of what they would normally put up. But it's a very spiffy HST exhibit.
So did you, Timothy, always want to be a scientist? And what was your path to the observatory? From being after you retired at JPL, or you did it, you must have been at the observatory volunteering the same time you were at JPL.
Yeah, so I did a little bit differently than most people do. My brother, for instance, knew he wanted to be an astronomer from the time he was 8 or 9 years old and never changed his mind. Just went right straight through, got his degrees in astronomy, worked at Lowell Observatory, worked at the telescope doing stuff, and then retired. I actually started out as kind of a philosopher, historian, linguist, just what I specialized in high school. And I didn't do too well in college the first time I tried. That's how I wound up being a sergeant in the Air Force, because I dodged the draft by joining the Air Force. But through my studies of philosophy and mathematics and logic, I realized eventually that what it was I really wanted to do was physics in particular. And I'd always been interested in science since I was a kid, because it's just a method of thinking about, you don't just guess and say, oh, well, it's got to be this, and then go off and assume it's true. You have to systematically assess your own thinking and figure out what works, what doesn't work. You have to do the math, you have to do the science, you have to do things right. And so that's how I got into physics. My graduate advisor at Cal State LA was Roland Carpenter. He's the man who used radar from Goldstone to discover the backwards rotation of Venus. He's the one who got me into JPL. And I was always interested in geophysics and astrophysics because they are very broad disciplines that make use of just about everything you can possibly learn in physics, rather than some specialties which are very narrowly focused on one little piece of the pie. And yes, I started at Mount Wilson in 1981 at the same time I had started at JPL. So I began in both places at the same time. I'm also an astronomer at the Garvey Ranch Observatory in the city of Monterey Park, which is open every Wednesday evening. And I will be there tomorrow. So if you just Google Garvey Ranch Observatory, come on down. A little telescope. It's owned by the city of Monterey Park, and Los Angeles Astronomical Society opens it for them. And then you can see me in person, the real me.
Oh, thank you very much. That's a nice opportunity for tomorrow. And I'm sure some people listening today will take advantage of that. So someone wants to know, when you're on the observatory grounds and it's closed, can you take your own telescope during the evening?
You, generally speaking, no. There's an access gate that closes at 5 o'clock. There are people who live up there, and so we try to limit the strangers after dark. Right now, the hiking trails are closed by the Forest Service, but there are hiking trails that come up the backside, and there are a lot of bicyclists that come up there. There are places along the highway where you can set up your own telescope, but we do occasionally have volunteer astronomers, like on lecture nights. We will ask people to set up little telescopes so that the large crowds of people waiting to get into the big telescopes will have something to do and not get completely bored. They can look through the little telescope. Then occasionally the Los Angeles Astronomical Society will arrange for open public star parties on this parking lot behind the Cosmic Cafe. It's a very good place to do it. We didn't do that earlier this year, and they were short-handed on the observatory, and so there's a bit of a problem doing it, but we tried to do that. So generally speaking, no, you can't just take your own telescope up there and set it up randomly.
Okay, thank you very much for that explanation. So were any of these buildings greatly affected by the terrible fire that was up there?
None of them were greatly affected. The monastery building, or the dormitory, as I like to call it, is down off the bottom of this picture. That's a small telescope dome. The white dot pretty near the bottom is off the bottom of this picture. But if you look behind me, let's see, it's I think it's actually, I think I pointed to the wrong place before. It's actually down here. The monastery building down here was smoke damaged. The firefighters who were not supposed to go down that narrow one-lane road along the crest and get trapped went down there anyway, and protected all the buildings down there from the fire. We had about 150 to 200 firefighters on the site during the fire. So we had a lot of support. They use our big parking lot to launch helicopters to make water drops around. And of course, we have buildings, firefighters can actually sleep indoors, which they consider a great luxury. And when the wind blew the smoke away from the telescope optics, even during the fire, the Bobcat fire in particular, we opened up the 60-inch telescope so the firefighters could look through it and see for themselves what it was they were protecting. And it actually worked out pretty well. The firefighters did a yeoman's job, to say the least, in protecting Mount Wilson Observatory. And we're all very impressed and happy with the results and their dedication to protecting us.
Well, yes, we have to thank the firemen very much for saving Mount Wilson. It was a horrific fire, horrific thing to watch and hear about. So we have enjoyed your presentation so much, Timothy. I know that everybody here is looking forward to going. How long should we allow on the road? That's kind of difficult to say, because some the weekends it's very busy. During the week, you have people going back and forth to work.
Yeah. So I would say it takes me roughly 35 to 40 minutes, probably 40 is better, from the foot of the Angeles Crest up to Mount Wilson, fairly fast road. And it's actually used as a racetrack at night. And sometimes on weekends, you'll find high performance sports cars flying along the highway. And there's so many of them, the highway patrol and sheriffs have given up trying to stop them because they're everywhere. But the Red Box Road is quite windy. So it takes me roughly 40 minutes to get from the bottom to the observatory. I've been going up that road for 40 years and I'm kind of used to it and probably drive it faster than most of you would. So I would say you should allow an hour from the bottom of the Angeles Crest Highway up to Mount Wilson Observatory, depending on how vigorously or timidly you drive on a windy mountain road. And of course, how long it will take you to get there depends on where you are. So I need to allow for like an hour and a half from my house to get up there. And if traffic is busy, I try to leave the house 2 hours in advance, because usually it can't be late. I have to be there. And so I'd rather be there early than be there late. When you're going up there, unless you've got some deadline event to worry about, you probably don't have that problem and can just get up there whenever you get up there.
Thank you for giving us that very valuable information. So somebody, let's see now, we have another question is, Are there any radio telescopes on or near Mount Wilson?
No, radio is one of the things we don't do. Yeah, we optical and near infrared. Radio astronomy around here is done either at Goldstone, which is on Fort Irwin near Barstow. That's the NASA Deep Space Communications Facility, although I think they're changing the name of that now because they think space isn't so deep anymore. But that's where the planetary radar and spacecraft communication is done. And if you go up Highway 395 south of Bishop, actually closer, I think, to Lone Pine, maybe, is the Caltech Owens Valley Radio Observatory. And that's where Caltech does its radio astronomy.
Well, thank you for that valuable information. And somebody wants to know, they're considering stopping at Mount Wilson with a motorcycle group on our way to Wrightwood for lunch. If we wanted to spend an hour there, what would you recommend we do? Well, you've given us a wonderful tour. You would start off at the cafe and then you would wander around. But what is the first place after the cafe you might go to?
If you only have an hour, and I've seen lots and lots of motorcycles up there, the motorcyclists and bicycle riders are a pretty good market for the Cosmic Cafe. If you only have an hour, probably your best bet is to go to the museum, where you'll see either right now the Hubble Space Telescope exhibit, or when it leaves in September, I think, you would see our old observatory exhibit. And if you go all the way back to the 100-inch dome, it has a visitor's gallery. You can climb up the stairs and look through a glass window at the telescope. You can't get into the 60-inch telescope at all without being on the guided tour. And the guided tours generally last at a minimum 2 hours and maybe a little longer. They're supposed to be 2 hours, but all of us talk too much and people ask lots of questions and it winds up being longer than that. So you won't have time to take a regular guided tour. You'll be on your own. So I'd say the museum and the 100-inch visitors gallery are probably your best bets.
Well, thank you so much, Timothy, for a fabulous afternoon visiting with you about Mount Wilson. I'm sure everybody will enjoy going and signing up for one of your tours and visit Mount Wilson, attend one of the many events. It's a beautiful place to go during the summertime and fall. So thank you so much. Everybody is thanking you. You're an awesome presenter, and the Pasadena Public Library is honored for you to have spent this afternoon with us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much again, Timothy. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.